All right, well, thank you all for coming here today, and it's 2:25, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jordan Hamel, and I work for a company called Amgen. If you have not heard of Amgen, that doesn't surprise me. Amgen it's a biotech company that started in 1980, not a very cloud-native era. But actually, there's a lot of application to what Amgen does in the cloud-native ecosystem, and today we're going to kind of talk a little bit about some contributions that I did to the Fluentd project, just for my own sake to gauge who is in the audience right now. How many of you are active users of Fluentd? So majority. And how many of you have ever tried to contribute to Fluentd or the ecosystem? None. Okay, great. So my goal at the end of this is to have at least one of you raise your hand and say, oh, I'm opening a PR now. I think we'll get there. So let's talk a little bit about Amgen. So Amgen, it's a values-based company, deeply rooted in science and innovation to transform new ideas and discoveries into medicines for patients with serious illnesses. Our mission is to serve patients. So I highly encourage you, it's a very regulated industry. Encourage you to go to amgen.com to see more public information about Amgen. Amgen is a global company. They're located in over 100 countries, and they definitely live by their mission of helping the patients. And I think you'll get from today why open source helps patients as well, and how the dots connect in between what we've done with Fluentd and how it continues to evolve as a product with being in use at Amgen. So let's get started. So if you ever read a lot of mythology and novels, you'll hear a lot about the hero's journey. And sometimes when we're working in software development, you feel like a hero when you've failed as hard as you could possibly fail, and you're able to then recover from it. So it was November 6, 2018. I was in a situation where I had a log. I'd already been working on this for like 2 days straight, and I had solved many individual problems, and I actually had the pull request merged. Everything worked great, but I was continuing to come up with errors like this, basically telling me that the AWS SQS client was getting a 400, unexpected error class. It looks like a non-existent queue error. The specified queue does not exist for this WSDL version. A lot of stuff that at that moment in the darkest hour of like debugging for myself that was very challenging, because at this point I've already fixed at least 6 or 7 different things over the last 48 hours prior to this moment. And I was at that moment where it's kind of like, do I want to continue working on this? It's just open source. I can find something else that's very similar. But where we'll get to in this story today is how we overcame this particular problem, but also the journey of getting through it. And I think it's important. One of the things I hope you can get out of today's session is that there's an importance in modeling what it takes to actually go from opening your own issue to then fixing your own issue and all the communication that goes on in between. That I don't really see that modeled very much in a talk format, so we'll see how it goes today. In my naivety, I asked the question, well, what WSDL version works then? It says it doesn't work for this WSDL version. But as you'll find out, that's not really pertinent to the solution. So again, we're going to go through the issue today and what issues were being solved and what issues were found, and then I had to open up many to get to the pull request that was eventually merged into the project, and why the fix matters, and why the fix matters to Amgen, why the fix matters to you, why contribute to Fluentd, and we'll go into some really specific examples of why I believe that Fluentd, outside of Kubernetes, I would almost argue that Fluentd is one of the most cloud-native projects there is. And I hope that you will leave today understanding that it's a lot more than just a logger. And then we'll look a little bit about biotech going cloud-native. And that is kind of an oxymoron for people that know much about the biotech and pharma industry, that are very regulated and very stable, where not a lot of change is introduced. You probably haven't been to many talks today that were featuring biotech companies. That's my guess, right? So I think that you'll be hopefully pleasantly surprised. So let's get into the issue. Every good issue starts off with a problem. What am I trying to do? So what we needed to do inside Fluentd was use a plugin called the S3 input plugin. It's one of the original plugins that was built for Fluentd a lot of years ago. And what Amgen needed to do was take all of the AWS accounts that Amgen uses, and we are already writing all of the CloudTrail logs, which are the API events, into a single S3 bucket. Standard AWS practice is to find a way to make all of your accounts use a similar trail and write to a single bucket that might be your security account or some other kind of logging account. So in the image, you can see there's 4 accounts, but there's actually many, many, many dozens more accounts than that. So it was coming into a very large bucket, all tagged in the specific account A that we'll call it. From there, what we needed to do was take the S3 bucket, enable the put events, so that for every event, for every log that was delivered from CloudTrail to a single bucket across hundreds of accounts, we needed to be able to get that information. The short story is that Fluentd's S3 input plugin uses the SQS queue as part of AWS platform to know what to read, right? Quiz, is S3 a directory? No, it's not. It's an object store. So you have to know where your objects are being stored upon delivery. So it writes that S3 key into an SQS queue for all the accounts because we're using a shared bucket. So whether you have 1 or you have 1,000 accounts, it would work the same. So in our particular situation, the account B that's separate from where the bucket was in a secure environment was where our Fluentd was running, where Elasticsearch was running, and also where our SQS queue was located. From here, basically, we wanted Fluentd to assume a role into account A, access the bucket, read the SQS queue in account B to read all the object keys, get the GZ file, do the decompression. All of this is in the documentation for the configuration of the S3 input plugin. Then we wanted to be able to write that to our Kafka queue for various reasons, because we may want to use this information for security, we may want to use it for operations. CloudTrail is kind of like AWS's API logging, right? It's events that are specific to the cloud platform that you're using. And then we use Fluentd to consume that topic and then deliver it out to Elasticsearch, which could then be consumed by our users using something like Grafana or Kibana, and they may query something in Elasticsearch. Hopefully, they'll come to an end result like this. So we can see something about the date of the record. We can see things like S3 bucket, where did it come from? We can see the S3 key, which includes things like, in the very bottom, you can see 585 is the account number, and then it goes to the type of log, it's CloudTrail, what region, the date, and the entire file, so that it's all tagged and searchable so that you can use it. So pretty standard case, but it wasn't that simple. One quick thing to highlight if you're new to Fluentd, one of the benefits of writing to message queues with Fluentd is that you have way less tension on your backend data store, in our case, which is Elasticsearch, if you can send to something like Kafka and then reduce the number of agents, because you may have like 5,000 or 10,000 or 50,000 Fluentd agents writing to Kafka, but only maybe 10 actually consuming the information and writing it out to Elasticsearch. So Fluent plugin S3 issue number 247 and the pull request 248. I tried to use the IAM user key and a local account queue, and the whole process worked. So everything that I wanted to do in the previous screen worked when I was using an isolated account and in AWS using an IAM user and key. I tried using the assume role feature, and it failed with an error saying that no region was set. So I'll take a look, and this is the actual stuff here. I wrote my comment as a new issue. No one was assigned the issue. No one commented on the issue. I was out alone in the vast internet that we all love. Very common case, but I tried to produce like what my configuration looked like. But basically, I had something completely wrong, of course. It was on my side, not the product side. So I realized that I needed to attach the assume role to the instance where EC2 was running Fluentd. So after I fixed that, then I realized that there was a different issue that I was still getting. I couldn't use the S3 key or the IAM key to assume the role. I had to use the instance to assume the role, which that worked, but I was still getting the region not set. So a little bit later, I find out that this issue was solved 4 years prior on the S3 output plugin. And so I highly recommend, as something we'll kind of summarize later, highly recommend always search in projects for their closed issues to see if there's some hidden gems that'll help you on new issues. It can really be powerful. So there was a fix there from 2015. And that was back in pull request number 122. So which basically allows you, if you're looking at it, the output plugin for Ruby here, the code is basically saying if you have an S3 region, make sure your credential options when you create your AWS client using STS, basically set that region as a parameter, because otherwise you have no way to find what you're looking for. So Seems to be working. Everything's closed. Great. A pull request for 122 fix was out, but I needed to go ahead and do it for mine. Use the exact same code. Everything's great, except for the DCO bot. If you're not familiar with DCO bot, that's basically the developer certificate of origin, which ensures that any project you commit to has been signed off in some way. The origin of this is actually way before GitHub, but it's the Linux Foundation's way of basically stating that you did the work that you said you did, and you have to sign it. But the Travis CI checks worked out. So once I got my DCO commit signed properly with my sign-off, it worked. And you can go back and always amend commits with sign-offs. So again, it's a very kind of like beginner type use case, but it's good to know. So the exact code that worked to set the S3 region is here. And now we open up the pull request number 249 and the issue 250. So I thought my pull request was good to go. And of course, friendly Cosmo0920 reviewed the pull request and realized that I forgot my two-space indentation. So very common newbie mistake in some ways, you could say. But friendly enough to leave the message, I fixed it, added another commit to the pull request, and I was good to go. So then when I went to actually test it, I noticed that with the AWS key and secret key, when it posts to the SQS queue, the message looked correct where you'd have an account and the queue name because I've already set that. But when I was using assume role credentials, it was posting into nothing, and there was nothing there. And so it wasn't working as as it should properly, and I didn't want to have to use an AWS IAM user and key because that's actually not the best security practice if you talk to your AWS account people. They'll tell you the same. So I opened up a new issue with some more details on the problem, which takes me back to my original problem here about the SQS queue name not being added to the URI properly. So the interesting thing about it is when we look a little bit deeper into this, what we can see here, and it might be a little blurry for you, but the actual post as I'm debugging this, I can see it's not adding the queue name. Something's wrong with it. Why? It's working fine when I use it in my own account. It's working fine when I'm using it with an IAM user, but something else is missing. And this is at the point of frustration where you're just like, all right, I could probably do this with Logstash. I could probably do this with a million other tools. Why continue on? This is already on the 6th, so it's like 2 days. And my full-time job is not to work on this specific issue. So I did what everyone ought to do and go ahead and Google it. The specified queue does not exist for this WSDL version. Unfortunately, had 50,000 results, so it's not exactly an uncommon issue. If anyone has ever faced this issue, you'll get a lot of interesting advice. But the spoiler alert, it's actually not the WSDL version is the problem. So one of the things I learned about debugging in the open source world is that you really know a lot more than you think you know if you just go back and look at the source code. What I can see here from the S3 input plugin in this is that it's using the AWS SDK for S3, the SQS, and the SQS QPolar. So I start to take a look at where I probably should have started at the very beginning, which is at the AWS documentation for Ruby. So the AWS SQS client in Ruby has a lot of details about the parameters you can set, things like region and credentials, and something interesting here, a queue owner AWS account ID. So it says to access a queue that belongs to another AWS account, use the queue owner AWS account ID parameter to specify the account ID of the queue's owner. So what did I do? I go back to Fluentd's configuration, I add the parameter, and of course it doesn't work because it's not in the code. Right? So eventually, what this is, when you create your client with SQS, you're pulling with all the options. You have the ability to not only assume a role that's attached to your Fluentd running instance, you can then assume another role where the bucket exists, which is actually owned by someone else, account A and account B. So if you're following this, it's because we have security over here who needs control of the bucket. We have a different team that owns the SQS queue and also pays for that SQS queue in a different budget, and we have to kind of work them out together. So if we look a little bit closer, basically we see a queue name, which we have already in the S3 input plugin, but there's this new parameter, queue owner AWS account ID. So it gives me an idea. Let's go ahead and take a look at what's there. This is what is there inside the S3 plugin at the time that I did the pull request. And it basically says, okay, here's your response, create the SQS client, get.get URL, the queue name, but no account owner for that queue. So we take a look over here, and in the configuration parameters, I basically just added an additional string, QOwner AWS account ID, with a default of nil. It's optional, and then added that into the parameters for the response of the actual code. So it looks like it's probably going to work. So I make a comment and say, modified to handle cross account ID that owns the SQS queue when the queue URL works per this documentation. It's in the pull request now. Woohoo! Pull is ready to go, right? Not quite. There's a person named Travis CI who's always ready to deny you. And Travis CI checks were unsuccessful, my DCO was working, but the integration test didn't work. And so when you're contributing, always make sure you check for the project's integration tests that are there. I think you'll save a lot of time in understanding what mock tests are expected, so that if you make contributions, you're really you're already plugged into the exact process that the maintainers are using. Because you're not gonna, you may have to write your own tests, but in a case like this where it's just a small patch, you're actually just modifying their mock tests directly. So in fact, it failed miserably. It failed all potential tests that could have failed, including the allowed failures. So at this point, it's kind of like one of those things where I guess the next thing I can do is just look at the results of the Travis CI tests, right? Inside of here, unfortunately, there's like 800 lines to go through. And at the very bottom, I see something about the failure of the gzip multiple streams for the input tests failing. So on that multiple streams, it's basically doing a mock test to see, can you get the gzip file where all the CloudTrail is being stored in the S3 bucket? But thankfully, the message is helpful and says, unexpected method invocation, the exact method that I just added to the plugin. So that gives me an idea of where to look. So essentially, at this point, before I get to look there, sometimes you'll be feeling this like as a developer, it's kind of like a shock that your stuff doesn't work on the first try, and even the second try or third try, or even like, this is a 35-minute talk, so we're compressing a lot of time here. After shock generally comes sadness, and that's kind of like where I want to encourage you to continue on in the projects that you use, like within the cloud native ecosystem. There's actually a lot of great communities, and we're going to talk a little bit later about like the community of Fluentd and kind of my interactions with it and how positive it's been in order to try to get help and try to like figure out like how you're going to get beyond the solution. So basically, I finally found the fix, and I had to go into the test Ruby file and notice that in the test, we basically stub our own AWS account ID, 123456789 that matches the size of an AWS account ID string, and then add that to the test specifically so that it can pass its tests. And it was finally fixed. So always remember that you don't work for Travis CI. Travis CI works for you. Never feel like it's like a blocker. It should actually be something that protects you, protects the project from getting bad code in. And I think that that's like a really valuable thing to learn if you're just getting started in contributing. And so it's time now to kind of go on to the pull request summary here. When you really look at this, the 2 days that I spent working on this particular issue that I basically made for myself because it helped our use case, essentially, there's just 8 lines of code. So it's 8 lines of Ruby code, which when I calculated it, that's like 1 line of code for every year that Masahiro's been working on Fluentd. So that's pretty impressive. Like, it doesn't take much code, actually, to make a project that's as mature as Fluentd to work for you in a new way. That's a really important lesson that I think would apply to other projects that you may work on. So eventually, we get to the 8 lines. We add the description for the config parameter. We modified the response to when it generates the SQS client to include the extra parameter of who owns the SQS queue. And then add our region test, which was the fix from the prior region issue. And then we add in our testing to allow for a fake dummy account ID for AWS and allow the response to work properly. And we get to our favorite part, repeatedly says merged, thanks, which is like a great feeling. If you've never done this, it's actually quite, it's a little bit of an adrenaline push, because it's like, wow, these people that I have no idea who they are, I have no idea who repeatedly is, work on something that actually I'm working for a company that I work for in a totally different place, it actually works. And that realization might be really obvious to you if you've worked in open source for a long time, but I think it's not that obvious for companies like Amgen and other large enterprises that don't have as much presence in open source contribution. So I think there's definitely some things we should go over about like why this fix matters. So first of all, just to talk about from Amgen's perspective, Amgen's CloudTrail data is now fully like accessible from all of these accounts, and the AWS delivery is around like 5 minutes, so it's still not quite like as real time as if you had the logs delivered in, maybe from the console. I forget even if that is a 5-minute delivery, but it's basically a 5-minute SLA. The pipeline accommodates now our kind of odd security structure where accounts over here are kind of part of the core accounts, and then we have like operational accounts and application accounts. Now, for anything we want to do with S3, I can have cross-account access, which is really key for teams that work in the company the size of Amgen. There's not one development team working on one revenue-generating product, right? So if you think about the complexity of companies like Amgen, Amgen has well over it's well over 1,500 like mainline in production applications, and really closer to about 4,000 when you go beyond that. And those are all sitting in different types of AWS accounts or on-premise. So this actually helps out a lot. And then we talk about like the different plugins that Fluentd has, and this is really where the magic's at of why the fix matters. So I can use things like record transformer, the rewrite tag filter, the exec out plugin to manipulate any record of CloudTrail for specific use cases by the account, the region, the content, or other retention needs. Because now I have all the details. I have S3 key. If you remember the previous screen, I have the S3 key, which gives me the entire object, so I know the account, the region. Maybe I have special rules for Europe, or maybe I have special rules for Asia that I want to track certain kinds of data for different regions, and I want to track our AWS usage in those regions in a different way. I'm able to do it really easily with the plugins that we have. So in taking a look at like an example of config of how this works, if you're looking at like the filter plugin, you kind of use like ** to match everything. We use the record transformer to add a tag of CloudTrail to everything, and that works fine. That tag will be like a key value pair inside of Elasticsearch if that's the final destination. And then I want to match everything that's tagged as CloudTrail and use a rewrite tag filter to take the value of the S3 key and look for the account number. So now I can tag everything with the actual account ID, which is really helpful for search query optimization. So now in the example result, instead of account.cloudtrail, it'll be like 0 to 9.cloudtrail. So now that is like a searchable field. That can be really helpful when you're dealing with hundreds of accounts and you don't know how many accounts you're going to have in the future. The other interesting thing, though, is that Fluentd has a lot of built-in plugins, and one of the built-in plugins that I think is the most underrated plugin is the exec out plugin. So this is actually, we'll get to that. Right first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grep the record for an event, something in AWS that I'm not really like wanting to have happen, like somebody creates an IAM user. Maybe I want to know about that, and there's plenty of like AWS ways to do this, but there's some specific reasons why I think Fluentd can use it and help you filter down to the exact use case that you're looking for. So I can filter down on the create IAM user within that message of the entire record from AWS, and then I can go ahead and look for the pattern of EU West 2, so I'm really concerned with like the Europe region. And then I can tag that as an IAM user create. So now from a security perspective, I have all the events on a searchable field with the tag of IAM user create just from the region US West 2. And that's now just another filter block within my Fluentd config, so I could send that data anywhere and do different things with it. So for example, like maybe I actually want to delete that user, right? Somebody went through all the effort of creating that user, but actually want to delete it right away because it's a security risk. So what you can do is run your own code, like you can have Ruby here execute a command, delete imuser.rb, and then it will actually, because you've already filtered down on the tag IAM user create, that actually passes the entire value of the S3 key and the message. So where you see keys under the type JSON, it'll pass those as like data to the code you want to execute. So it passes the whole block. You can then take that code and then like parse it out and do what you want to do with it. So now you have basically an automated way to make sure no one will create IAM users in the US West region, which is kind of interesting, or the EU region in this case. There's other ways to do it, but this should start getting in your mind some other use cases of what you could do once you start thinking about how to connect a lot of these plugins together. So let's go on a little bit. One more benefit again was about the scale. This will scale with the number of accounts that you have. And if you're worried about like your SQS queue getting too big, that actually scales as well. This is an example of like when we shut off the Fluentd, our SQS messages visible went up to like 60 million. And that's a lot of messages for a lot of different AWS accounts. But all I have to do is spin up more containers. So it scales. So you can spin up like 25 instances of Fluentd on a single Docker host. And in like a couple of hours, we can see this kind of like down into the right motion here of like every message that was visible in the queue is now down to 0. And all the messages received, it's like up to 250,000 during that time per moment, so to speak. It's not at a granular level here. But basically, it keeps up with as large of your queue as you have. And that's up to you and how you want to manage it. So some issue PR and pull request takeaways that I think are important to kind of go over. Stay curious and persistent. I think that's a really important thing to do. Learn to debug and troubleshoot publicly. Plan out what you want to achieve before you start. Check the contribution guide if it's available. Learning to troubleshoot in public is like hard for people that are kind of shy. They don't want to reveal their identity. They may not be able to work with other people. I think that's a really important thing to do. And again, search the closed PRs before you open them. Overcome your imposter syndrome by just getting the code out there. My manager says that the working code wins. And the reality is, like, when you have some code that you think is working locally, go ahead and test it out with a project and see if you can get it merged, because other people may need it for their particular case. And you want to be able to model the kind of behavior you hope from others that you work with. So by giving back to a community, that actually spurs like other people to give back. And definitely don't be a project wallflower. Your contribution matters, whether it's on documentation or actual code. And the Fluentd community is very welcoming. I think it's highly recommended to work in inclusive communities. Just remember to thank people. These people are dedicating their time. They may be paid for it, they may not be, but it never hurts to be kind. So we've got a lot more to go through, and let's continue on to a little bit about why I can contribute to Fluentd specifically. And I think these are some of the lessons that are important. Fluentd advertises itself as a unified logging layer. You can take data from here and put it over here. You can transform the data. You can mutate the data. It's simple. It's easy. It's open source, proven reliability. Again, this project came out in 2011. I was still working for an e-commerce company called Newegg.com during that time, and we were already using Apache Flume. But looking at the project, like it's a really long time in internet years of a project that is now part of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and has a proven community to do it. I think it's, So I want to talk a little bit about this part. So when you think about the plugin ecosystem, I like to think of the analogy of like music and deep cuts. So like if you're a fan of any particular musician or rock band, some of like the music that is a little bit harder to find for that particular artist can be considered like a deep cut because it's really good, but not a lot of people know about it. And I think that's the way that the plugin ecosystem at Fluentd is right now. There's a plugin for serial port, which actually does exactly what you think it does. If your company's not using the Internet of Things and you just have a bunch of things and you can plug it in a serial port, you can communicate to it. JQ, record transformer, rewrite, stats notifier, unique counter, validate tag filter. All of this can be used to create a secure pipeline so that you can get any data out of your pipeline before you go and execute other things. The message queues, they support Kafka, MQTT, AMQ, Kinesis, SQS, Google Cloud, PubSub, databases, ClickHouse, Timescale, InfluxDB, Scribe, which is really interesting. That's like an open source database from Facebook. This is like the original plugin for the first version of that database that they released, which they re-released earlier this month. LevelDB, Vertica, which is kind of HDFS based, and then they even support a data plugin to take things from CollectD and store it into InfluxDB, like as like a pass me off kind of like thing. Messaging, if you need notifications, it's all there. In the cloud, each one of these cloud platforms, Aliyun, Azure, AWS, GCP, OpenStack, that's the count of the number of plugins for each cloud platform. That's a lot. And so there's really a deep, rich integration if you're in a hybrid environment or if you're in a cloud native environment only. And that's why I say it's kind of like the cloud native project outside of Kubernetes. If you think about like this in terms of like where this sits in the ecosystem, projects like Telegraph, CollectD, Logstash, they all have a lot of plugins, but Fluentd has like over 650. And even that is kind of being humble, because if you look on Ruby, you'll find over 990 gems that are labeled Fluentd plugin. And that's saying a lot, because it has a package manager. Great community way to build out your ecosystem is by using a package manager. So this is one of the original logos that Fluentd uses to kind of describe like what it does and what happens when you have it afterwards. And I want to take a minute to do a quick demo for us today. So what I've got basically running is, we're going to tail this file for some results, and then I'm going to send things to the HTTP input that are kind of like events that are happening. So this way you can see some example of like how this works. So I'm going to talk about an event like KubeCon. If I send this to HTTP Fluentd 988, that's actually running locally, and the event is KubeCon itself. I can send it, and then I can take a look and see that, okay, it's KubeCon, it's CloudNativeCon 2. So there's some event there. And I'll talk to you about like where this is going. This is not going directly to the file. This is actually calling out to another API. You'll see the details in a minute. There's a few other events that may be going on here this week that you're doing, like KubeCon coffee. Everybody needs coffee. Anyone else coffee fan? If you're coffee time, the open Java bar for everyone. That's a minor joke on OpenJDK. The KubeCon after party, you don't want to miss that, because we're in San Diego. So you may want to get your tacos, and it's free. And if you start thinking about like where else this could go, let's think about like what if you have like something real that you want to actually like make like a statement on here. If I want to post like an actual error, like say there was a problem with kube control or something like that, I can actually send a message, and then let's do cannot post there. Let's do this error. So let's say we have a kube control error. Now I can actually execute and send a message back saying the kube control delete f recent deployment YAML ran successfully in 1 second and 300 milliseconds. So what's that actually doing? You're piping things together so that actually as you take that error event, you do something with it. Because what are you going to do? Send it to Elasticsearch and wait for somebody to query that and then take some action? You can plug all of this in together. And if we want to take a quick look at like what this is doing, this is actually, like if I look at my Fluentd config, this is actually matching the event type and then running executions on a simple bash script, which is then calling another API to return the results back to a file, which is what I'm tailing here. So if you start like really putting this in your mind, you can control anything in your cloud native ecosystem with Fluentd. And that's like, imagine GitHub has their actions now. If you have the log file on your Git version control, you can create your own actions very easily using this kind of thing. So it's really powerful. Let's continue on. It's built for observability and beyond. Logs, Fluentd, one thing I've always appreciated with them is that it actually has always treated logs as a continuous event stream, because you can structure anything, you can handle high cardinality, you can handle all these things that you want to do. And if you think about like companies like AppDynamics, Elastic, Splunk, SignalFx, Datadog, New Relic, Grafana Loki, even Honeycomb, all of these are like actually have plugins for Fluentd. And if you look close enough on the Fluentd bird, it's actually smiling knowing that they're all under its wing. So I think it's really a testament to the reliability of it. And why I say it's built for beyond observability, one of the things that we do at Amgen are the clinical trials for our teams and the drugs that are being processed. We're actually using Fluentd now to process and give back to our business users what has happened with the blinded data and unblinded data. You don't really need to be a scientist to know that drug data that is blinded should not be given to the unblinded people at the wrong time. And Fluentd is a great project to use that in. It's open source. There's a lot of value in the enterprise open source and user growth that's growing, and I expect to see this growth continue. It's a talent and career thing if you're trying to attract talent of why you should give back to something like Fluentd. It gets you in a position where you can collaborate with other people that are maybe they're competitors, maybe not. But it's the only way to really get ahead if you can take a joint effort of people that are working on the same problem space. And you're really going to thank yourself in the future when you move to another company and you can still continue to work on the project that you were working on at a company that you left. That can be really interesting, and I think Kubernetes is a really good example of that, as a lot of the original Kubernetes maintainers are now working at different companies. The plugins are community driven, and it's a very humble thing. There's very few companies or projects that have this kind of thing on their website where it talks about the problems of the plugin and actually talks about what are the pros and cons of using it and the performance metrics. That can be really hard to find in a commercial product because they need to sell you on the idea of it. Whereas Fluentd is really a down-to-earth community. And as a career path, I'm someone who's actually gone to management, gone back to as an individual contributor, and now I'm back as management again. You can actually contribute to open source projects without getting in the way of your direct reports. Is anyone here a manager? Anyone here a manager of managers? Yeah, not quite. There's really a good way to stay technical by contributing to projects that aren't a direct dependency inside of the teams that you're with. If you think about the number of software employees and employees at these companies, this is just a really generous estimate of the number of software engineers at these companies. And if you look at Fortune 500, there's 28 million employees and approximately 4 million developers at those companies. The trend is, the train's already left. It's only a matter of time before companies like Amgen and other Fortune 500 companies continue to get integrated with CNCF projects. And I think that there's a real high value in speeding up the delivery of a product as a project, because that's really, the reality is that projects and products, the lines are blurring at what they are. So just to kind of end it today, I wanted to talk quickly a little bit about why Amgen and why this is really important. The FDA really likes traceability and reproducibility that the cloud gives you, the audit trails. Everybody in the whole industry, including patients, wants therapies at a lower cost. What does it take? It takes the ability to get through the discovery to the production in a much faster way. And I believe that cloud native projects can help you do that. As a statement that you'll find on our website, at Amgen, we discover, develop, and manufacture medicines to enable more moments in the lives of more people, moments of joy, moments of friendship, moments of life. For moments like these, we innovate and we work boldly, tirelessly, and passionately to serve the ones that matter, the patients. And I think that Amgen is committed to doing that in their technical fields and also in their in the drugs that they produce. So with that, I'd like to thank the whole community and thank you for coming to today's talk. Please email kubernetes@amgen.com if you're interested in building meaningful products at Amgen. I'll be here for the rest of the week, as well as another colleague of mine. We'd love to talk to you if you're interested in finding out a little bit more. Hope this was a fun kind of introduction to Fluentd. For some of you, if you're not actively contributing, highly encourage you to do it, and thank you.